Va bene. Non vedo Raffaella, vediamo se ci sente.
Ma c'era fino a un secondo fa,
Anch'io,
c'era.
sì, sì.
Io credo
E
di
stai qua.
esserci, poi
Ah, sì, sì,
se
sì.
sono
Non la vedi
svanita
perché è
non...
vicino a te nello schermo, quindi...
Ah, ok, bene, bene.
Ci sono, ci sono.
Allora, dovremmo, non so, se siete d'accordo potremmo iniziare, voi cosa dite?
Sì, sì.
Sì, sono d'accordo.
Va bene, vedo che anche le nostre le relatrici della mattinata sono connesse. Michael Hillen credo si connetterà con qualche minuto di ritardo perché aveva delle cose da sistemare questa mattina. Sono io. Allora, buongiorno a tutti e benvenuti di nuovo a questa quarta sezione del convegno Cicero Digitalis dedicata alle lettere di Cicerone, Focus on the Letters. Se mi permettete una piccola nota personale, io sono molto affezionata alle lettere di Cicerone perché sulle lettere di Cicerone mi sono laureata tanti anni fa sotto la guida di Giovanna Garbarino. Giovanna Garbarino è stata la mia maestra e come molti sanno è scomparsa pochi mesi fa, il 4 maggio del 2020. Non per Covid, ma certamente il Covid ci ha impedito di salutarla e ricordarla, non come avrebbe voluto perché chi la conosce lo sa, era persona molto schiva, ma certamente come avrebbe meritato. Alle lettere di Cicerone lei ha dedicato un lavoro, la traduzione italiana, edizione alla traduzione italiana uscita per UTET nel 2008, curata insieme a Raffaella Tabacco. Come vedete, siamo un gruppo di persone che lavorano spesso insieme nel modo, nell'accezione più corretta del termine e anche più giusta. Quindi è anche bello ricordarla così, ricordare Giovanna Garbarino in un modo legato a una delle sue ultime opere. Sempre per quanto riguarda le lettere di Cicerone, poi magari più tardi dirà qualcosa lui personalmente, Ermanno Malaspina aveva curato tanti anni fa l'edizione in CD-ROM della cronologia ciceroniana, che è uno strumento fondamentale per chiunque si occupi delle lettere. Tanti anni fa probabilmente era un progetto pionieristico e molto avanti, fare questa cronologia in CD-ROM e credo abbia comportato molto lavoro e anche molto lavoro tecnico, molte discussioni tecniche. Oggi la cronologia è disponibile sul sito della SIAC, però magari ci dirà poi lui se è in vista qualche progetto ulteriore che sarebbe necessario, però come tante cose sarebbero necessarie, però ne riparleremo. Darei quindi la parola alla prima oratrice della giornata. So I switch to English because she comes from the UK. It's a pleasure to me to introduce Olivia Elder. Olivia Elder is actually a lecturer in ancient history at Oxford, Merton College. She did her BA and MA at Corpus Christi College, always Oxford, but after that she moved to Cambridge, where she earned her PhD with a thesis entitled Language and the Politics of Roman Identity. She has also spent some time in Rome from September 2018 to August 2019 as a fellow of the British School in Rome. Maybe she understands and speaks some Italian due to this experience, I don't know. Olivia is an ancient historian with a particular interest in bilingualism and epistolography. That is also shown clearly by her first book, co-authored with Alex Mullen and entitled The Language of Roman Letters, Bilingual Epistolography from Cicero to Fronto, published with Cambridge University Press in 2019. Today, the title of her paper suggests she's going to speak about this topic, but from a digital point of view. The title of this paper is Ciceronian Code, Digital Approaches to Cicero Epistolary Code Switching. So please, Olivia, feel free to start.
Thank you very much, Alice, for the kind introduction. Thank you. And I'd like to also thank the organisers very much for all their efforts in putting the conference on. I'm really grateful that it's been able to go ahead, even in the difficult circumstances. So I'm just going to share my screen. I hope, can you all now see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you very much for allowing me to speak in English. I do indeed understand some Italian, but not yet at the stage where I'm able to give a paper in Italian. So thank you for forgiving me for speaking English. So at the beginning of this paper, I'd also like to acknowledge the other members of the Code Switching in Roman Literature Network, whose support has been really invaluable to my work on Cicero's letters. And I'd especially like to give thanks to Alex Mullen, who's worked with me first as a supervisor and then as a co-author, and also give thanks to Scott Vanderbilt, without whose technical expertise we'd have been unable to set up the online database that I'm going to talk about in my talk today. Okay, so in a letter to Atticus of July 65 BC, Cicero has to talk himself out of an awkward situation. Atticus's uncle Caecilius has asked Cicero to speak in court against Satyrus. Cicero wants to decline Caecilius's request because Satyrus is one of his clients. But to refuse Caecilius's request is to risk offending Atticus. So in his letter, Cicero must construct an elaborate argument cum apology. Cicero argues that his refusal is made on moral grounds, not out of self-interest, because Cicero is currently canvassing for the upcoming consular elections. The use of Greek in this letter is key to the construction of Cicero's argument and tone. First, he uses a quotation from Homer to underline the seriousness of the situation that he finds himself in. The quotation comes from a critical moment in Iliad Book 22, when Hector is fighting with Achilles for his life. By drawing a parallel with this moment from the Iliad, Cicero shows how concerned he is about the present moment. But Cicero gives only the beginning of this quotation. Atticus has to fill in the gaps to discover its context, context, and significance. And the expectation that Atticus will be able to do this flatters Atticus's knowledge of Greek literature. And this flattery is a key part of Cicero's attempt to win over Atticus in this letter. So this Greek quotation both characterizes the situation and does so in a way that is calculated to win Atticus over. Having made his argument, Cicero moves on to thank Atticus for his recent gift of a Hermathena, using Greek, which has been corrupted in the manuscript tradition, to describe the positive impact of this gift on his hallway. This Greek moves Cicero and Atticus away from the awkwardness of the letter's earlier discussion and acts as a reminder of their shared cultural interests. It ends the letter on a lighter, friendlier note. So this short introductory example illustrates how important the judicious use of Greek is as a communication strategy in Cicero's letters. Greek is a really carefully deployed tool that Cicero uses to construct relationships and arguments. The presence of Greek is a feature of Cicero's correspondence that has been noted ever since the Greek word lists of Steele and Tyrrell and Purser. And more recent analysis of the Greek in the early 21st century by Adams and Swain has employed the sociolinguistic concept of code switching, borrowed from studies of modern bilingualism. Adams, however, said that much remains to be done on Ciceronian code switching and called explicitly for more systematic analysis. And my work on Cicero's code switching using digital tools has been a response to Adams' call. An online digital database that we've set up has enabled new quantitative and systematic analysis of Cicero's code switching. Within this database, every instance of code switching in Cicero's letters is collected and categorized. The database allows us to look beyond individual examples and right across the correspondence. And this enables a more precise idea of when and why Cicero switched into Greek, which opens up new readings across the correspondence. In this paper, I want to give outline some findings about the patterns of Greek in Cicero's letters based on the database, and then offer some suggestions of further direction for research using the database. But first, I want to give a little bit more introduction to the database itself. So it's now available online in a fully open access and fully searchable format for the use of other researchers on the website of the Code Switching in Roman Literature Network hosted at Cambridge. And it currently includes data not only on code switching in Cicero's letters, but also on code switching in letter corpora by Pliny and Fronto, and data on code switching in Suetonius, both from letters and other sources. One key aim of the database is to enable comparisons between different authors and corpora, to understand how the use of Greek varies across them. And the hope is that data from more authors and more corpora can be added in future to extend these comparisons. So in the database, we've recorded several pieces of information about each code switch. I've given the entry for a letter for a code switch from a letter from Caesar to Caesar that I will discuss later. So we give the corpus that the letter comes from, its textual reference, the date. As I'm going to discuss, a key question for me has been how the patterns of Cicero's code switching vary over time. The source of the code switch, this is obviously always letter in the case of the Ciceronian correspondence, but in the case of the Suetonian correspondence, there are various possible options. We then give the author and addressee of the code switch. We then give a citation of the Greek and its Latin context. And we've then categorized the code switch in some important ways. So first of all, we've determined whether it's an inter or an intrasentential switch, that is whether it occurs within or between sentences. This is quite important for linguistic analysis, and because traditionally a high proportion of intrasentential switching within a text has been interpreted as a sign of more intimate language patterns. So the balance between intra and intersentential switching can provide revealing information about the nature of the epistolary relationships. So we've then assigned a function, in this case it's a literary quotation, to the code switch. And I'm really happy to discuss in questions the kind of way that we came up with these functions and the list of them. This was probably the most difficult and subjective part of setting up the database and determining the functions. But to make it as consistent as possible, we really collaborated extensively. I think this collaboration is something that is really crucial in building digital data sets. So we've then recorded syntactical and grammatical information about the Greek, although we haven't yet made all of this data available online, and we're still in the process of checking it. But again, that's something that we can discuss. So the main focus of my own work on Cicero has been historical and sociolinguistic. So this linguistic information has been less relevant to my own research questions. But as I'm going to highlight, this means there's a lot of scope for further technical linguistic analysis of Cicero's code switching. And this analysis could both make use of existing data and extend it using the online data sets. So we've then given a brief summary of the context of each code switch for people to be able to orientate it in the text, and then we've given any important linguistic, literary or historical commentary about it. So as you can hopefully see, there's a lot of information in the database, and its fully searchable format gives the potential to be able to slice and analyze the code switches in multiple different ways, by date, by addressee, by function, and or to concentrate analysis on a subset of them, depending on what questions you want to use the data set to answer. And the data from search queries can be downloaded in an Excel or .csv file for researchers. Okay, so having introduced the database, I want to outline some of the findings from it. So one of, for me, the opportunities of the database is that it enables both macro level quantitative analysis across the whole correspondence and more micro level analysis of code switching within specific epistolary relationships. I'm going to concentrate first on some of my macro level findings and then on an example of a specific epistolary relationship. So a macro level analysis of Cicero's Greek using the database gives insights into several areas: the frequency of Cicero's code switching, the proportions of intra and intersentential switching, as I said, significant because of the perceived relationship between these types of switching and the intimacy of language patterns, and the spread of different functions of Cicero's Greek. I've conducted research into all of these different areas, and I'd be really happy to discuss them further in questions. But I want to concentrate here on some key findings that are especially illustrative of the practices of code switching across the correspondence. Sorry for some faffing there, my computer had a bit of a moment. So first, I want to consider the comparisons between language patterns across the different Ciceronian letter collections, ad Atticum, ad Familiares, and ad Quintum Fratrum. So it's sometimes been assumed that the language of Cicero's letters to Atticus is qualitatively different because of the different and closer quality of Cicero and Atticus's relationship. But the database can be used to demonstrate empirically that there are several areas of overlap between the language of the letters to Atticus and the language of the letters to others. As is well known, Greek is more frequent in letters to Atticus than in letters ad familiares, probably partly because of Atticus's own assumed Greek identity. But in other ways, the code switching to Atticus is less of an outlier. The proportions of intra and intersentential switching are remarkably consistent across all three Ciceronian corpora. That is, the intimacy of the language patterns are identical in all three. And the distribution of functions of Greek is also consistent. As this table shows, the same functions of Greek dominate in all three letter collections. So although Cicero uses more Greek to Atticus, the type and function of this Greek is similar to the code switching in letters to other addressees. And to me, this is very striking. As the opening example of my paper showed, Cicero and Atticus's relationship is not always the close and easy friendship it's often painted as. Cicero also had to negotiate personal, political, and social situations in letters to Atticus. And so these letters to Atticus are as carefully crafted as those to other correspondents. And the empirical analysis of Cicero's code switching shows that the Greek was a key part of this negotiation in the letters. So another key finding is around the variation over time within Cicero's code switching. This variation is revealing of an important purpose of Cicero's code switching and of the letters more widely. Given the relative size of the correspondence, a detailed analysis of variation over time is most practical for the letters to Atticus, but one possible future direction for research using the data in the database would be for a comparison between chronological variation in letters to Atticus and chronological variation in letters to others. So the table on the slide shows the frequency of Greek code switching by year and, where it's possible, by month. Periods of time with letters but no code switches are shown, with a frequency of 0. Periods of time from when no extant letters survive are not shown. The variation in the frequency of Cicero's code switching has been highlighted previously, and Adams argued that these variations show the psychological dimension of Cicero's code switching. He suggests that the absence of Greek during Cicero's exile and after his daughter Tullia's death show that code switching was just a light-hearted game that was dropped when Cicero was distressed. But my quantitative analysis of the types and, importantly, functions of the code switching across the whole correspondence using the database suggests something different. Although periods of infrequent code switching do coincide with some of Cicero's low points, variations of frequency in Cicero's Greek are actually revealing of a particular function of Cicero's code switching. They show that it was more than just a light-hearted game. And the evidence of code switching from January to May 49 shows this especially clearly. So January to May 49 was not a period of depression on the same level as Cicero's exile, but it was a period of acute crisis. Cicero was torn over what action to take in the civil war, and his letters from this time are filled with anxiety. Cicero's letters from this period contain often strikingly similar emotional language to his letters from exile. In both sets of letters, Cicero claims to be highly distressed, repeating the trope that he's so distracted that he has nothing to write about. And given the similarity between the emotions and the language of the letters from exile and those in 49, I think it's quite difficult to explain why, if code switching is linked to Cicero's emotional state, the letters from exile would contain no Greek, and the letters from 49, some of the highest rates of code switching in the correspondence. So to explain the different frequency of code switching in the letters from exile and the letters from civil war, I think we need to think differently about the purpose of Cicero's Greek. And an analysis of the functions of Greek in 49 using the database illustrate what this purpose was. During these months, there's a much higher proportion of literary quotations, 16% as opposed to an average of 11% in the correspondence as a whole. And this type of code switch was used to sum up and reflect upon problems that Cicero faced. So I've given this example of Cicero using a quotation from Homer to make sense of Pompey's abandonment of Rome, and compare Pompey's behaviour with former leaders, including those in the Iliad, who've also had to make a choice about whether or not to abandon a city. So the patterns and functions of Cicero's Greek, which are revealed by quantitative analysis of the whole data set, show that Cicero's code switching is a method that he uses to reason through and reflect on his dilemma. It serves a more concrete purpose than Adams's characterization of it as a light-hearted game suggests. And after the high rates of code switching in 49, there's a complete absence of code switching throughout the rest of the Civil War in 48 to 47. This reflects the fact that Cicero had fewer decisions to make than he had at the war's outbreak. Once he decided to join Pompey, he had little to do and found himself very much on the margins of the war. And indeed, it's not until 46, when he's allowed back to Rome by Caesar, that Cicero once again began to have political relevance. And it's also in 46 that his code switching restarts. We get a really quite high frequency of code switching in 46. So I think, again, these patterns show the way that code switching is being used to negotiate problems. And I think the absence of code switching in the exile letters can be explained in the same terms. In these letters, Cicero presents his exile not as a problem that can be solved or reasoned through or reflected upon, but as a problem with no way out. And therefore there's no need to use Greek because there's nothing to use it to negotiate. And I think this idea of the exile letters fits with Hutchinson's characterization of the language of the exile letters, not as unstructured outpourings of grief, but as a deliberate performance of grief. And the dropping of Greek was part of this performance of grief. So again, this shows that code switching was not a straightforward reflection of Cicero's psychological state, but a really careful communication strategy within the letters. But it's only with an understanding of the patterns and functions of code switching across the correspondence as a whole, which is enabled by the database and quantitative analysis, that we can see this. So the macro level quantitative analysis of the corpus of correspondence also provides a framework for the detailed analysis of specific epistolary relationships within the corpus. And the database enables comparison between patterns of code switching that are normal and patterns of code switching within particular relationships, showing where they diverge from the norm. Given the limitations of time, I'm going to concentrate here on a single example of the correspondence with Caesar, but I'm happy to talk more about this in questions. So the patterns of Cicero's use of Greek in letters to Caesar is really distinctive within the correspondence, as the quantitative analysis demonstrates. This is an example of a letter to Fam 13.15, which is a letter from Cicero to Caesar recommending Procilius. I'm sorry, this is a really horrible slide with lots of text, but I wanted you to be able to see the whole letter. The patterns of Greek in this letter are really unusual. Although intersentential switching, so that's switching between sentences, the less intimate language pattern, make up only 9% of the code switching in the Ciceronian corpus as a whole. 5 of the 6 switches in this letter to Caesar are intersentential. This is a much less kind of intimate language form than is the norm in Cicero. And the large number of literary quotations here is also striking. We get 6 literary quotations here, and that's a really large proportion of the 16 total literary quotations from the whole corpus ad familiares. And I think that the Greek quotations do a lot of work in constructing the defense that Cicero is making in this letter. Cicero himself tells us that this is not a normal letter of recommendation. And Shackleton Bailey has shown that there's a lot going on beneath the surface. The letter's not just about recommending Procilius, but about defending Cicero from Caesar's concern that Cicero was conspiring against him. And as I say, the Greek does a lot of work in making this argument. So the database provides us with data to support, provides us the data to suggest that the code switching patterns of this letter were not unusual within communications between Cicero and Caesar. the patterns of code switching within the letter to Caesar are really strikingly similar when you look at the database to the code switching patterns in the letters that Cicero sent to his brother in Gaul in 54. In these letters to Quintus, there are also unusually high numbers of literary quotations and intersentential switching. I've given one example as it appears in the database. Henderson has previously suggested that the addressee of these letters was not really Quintus, but Caesar, under whom Quintus was serving. And the similarity between the patterns of Greek in these two letters provides empirical data to support Henderson's suggestion. The ability to undertake this kind of linguistic fingerprinting, to identify code switching patterns that are distinctive to particular authors and addressees, that in turn is able to support new readings of the correspondence, is for me one of the exciting opportunities of this digital dataset. So in the final section of my paper, I want to briefly consider some future directions for research which can make use of and extend the data in the database. So there's scope for a lot more analysis from different angles of Ciceronian code switching, and the database enables these analyses to be done empirically, with reference to the entire data set of Cicero's Greek, rather than a partial selection, as has generally been the case in earlier studies. But you could also use the online database to isolate a particular type or function of the Greek and consider its usage and variation across the corpus. And there's particular scope for further linguistic analysis of the grammar, syntax, and lexicon of the Greek in Cicero's letters, and especially in the letters at Atticum. So there's also scope for thinking more about the nature and lexicon of Cicero's Greek. O'Sullivan has shown recently that Cicero's Greek is much more varied than has traditionally been assumed. It makes much more use of classical Greek language and shows less influence from contemporary Koine. And extending the digital database so that it includes information on all these different aspects of the Greek would be valuable. It'd be useful to have all the data available about Cicero's Greek in one place. And now that all of the Greek in Cicero's letters has been made available online, it might be useful to include links to other online resources that enable the study of this Greek. I think it could be especially useful to include links to other online resources like the TLG or editions of Papyri, which is often the only place where we have comparanda for Greek words used by Cicero. And this would enable identification of where Cicero's Greek words are attested elsewhere and allow us to isolate where Greek words are unique to Cicero based on the latest data. And so this is an example of where digital tools and links between data sets can enable more efficient linguistic analysis. I'd also really like to extend the database to include other authors and texts. A key aim behind the online database was that it could enable comparisons between different corpora. Cicero's practice influenced letter writers both ancient and modern, and comparative analysis enables this influence to be traced. In turn, these comparisons shed light on what was distinctive or not about Ciceronian practice. So Alex Mullen and I have already undertaken comparison between epistolary code switching in Cicero and in Pliny, Fronto, and Suetonius, but later authors like Ausonius, Jerome, Sidonius Apollinaris, and Symmachus also engage in extensive Greek code switching and could be usefully included in the database. The possibility of comparison and dialogue with more modern evidence is for me especially exciting. Bilingualism, and especially code switching, is an area where scholars of ancient and modern languages have much to learn from one another. Comparisons between ancient and modern texts can sharpen our understanding of the theories, norms, and constraints on code switching. And there are some existing digital corpora of modern letters that could be compared to the ancient corpora. One example is the corpus of early English correspondence. It's much larger than our database of ancient letters, and it's not just focused on code switching, although it includes many examples of code switching, and it's been used to write several articles about code switching in the early modern context. But like our database, the corpus has also been established with historical sociolinguistics in mind. Online open access datasets, especially when they're clearly contextualized and categorized using terms familiar to sociolinguists working from different historical periods, make comparisons between ancient and modern material much easier. So to move to a conclusion, In this paper and in my own work on Cicero's code switching, I hope to have shown in one focused area the difference that digital tools and the systematic quantitative analysis they enable can make to our understanding of Ciceronian texts. Databases in which material is collected and categorized are useful for identifying underlying patterns and trends and divergences from them. And importantly, this kind of database leaves room for further data input and analysis from other scholars. But I want to end by moving from the general to the specific to the general and offering a couple of reflections on what this work has reinforced to me about opportunities in digital humanities more widely. First is one note of caution. In my view, digital tools supplement but do not replace traditional close philological analysis. Understanding the patterns of Greek, for example, in Cicero, requires both macro-level analysis and continued close reading of letters in context. But I think the digital tools bring many exciting opportunities. They make systematic analysis far more efficient and far more possible. And building tools and data sets offers significant scope for productive collaboration. And such collaborative work is something that I'd like to see more of in the discipline. It's especially important, of course, to ensure that data sets are open access wherever possible, because it allows scholars to use and manipulate the data to answer their own research questions. And it also means that the data can be used freely by scholars both within and beyond classics. This cross-disciplinary collaboration has obvious importance in sociolinguistics, but there are exciting opportunities for such collaboration between ancient and modern more widely too. Thank you.
Thank you for this lively and very engaging presentation. We are all eager to know a little more about Caesar, I'm sure. I see already 2 questions. If anybody have any question, can raise his hand or let me know in the chat. Okay, the first one is Nadia Rosso. Nadia Rosso is a colleague of mine and she's an expert of code switching. So I think she has some curiosity about it. Please, Nadia.
Thanks for your very interesting presentation. Just a curiosity. Are in this corpus there any cases of mixed code switching? I mean inter and intra-sentential together, such as in the epistole of Ausonius, by Ausonius, the 6th epistle in particular.
Thank you for your question. So do you mean, are there examples where you get both intra and intersentential in the same letter?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes, a lot of them actually. So yeah, yes, essentially yes. As I say, it's quite interesting that the intersentential switching really represents quite a small proportion of the switching in all 3 of the Ciceronian letter collections. But in almost all cases where it appears alongside intrasentential switching. That's actually why the Caesar letters are again so unusual, because you get the kind of long sequence of intersentential switching, which I think is one of the things that shows actually how distinctive those language patterns are there. But thank you very much for the question.
Thank you.
Melanie, do you have a question? Okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I had a question, if I may, on your database. When, maybe if it's possible to put on the screen of the database, when you speak about function of the bilingualism, can you explain what are the different characterization? Because as I think I've seen only quotation, and I was thinking about a letter to Atticus 2:2, when is only quoting some words in Greek, politeia, or that kind of letter. And I'm very interested to know, how do you characterize in your database this kind of Greek quotations? I don't know if you use quotation or not. It was my question.
This is a really great question. Thank you. I would show you on the database how we've done it, but I'm not going to trust my technical skills. So perhaps I can talk you through this later, but I can give you a kind of general answer. There's a full list of all the functions of the code switches actually on the website under the About list. But in answer to your specific question, so we've reserved the term quotation for quotations that are from specific known sources, like literary works or proverbs or philosophical works. We've also used it where Cicero is quoting somebody else. So for example, there are various instances in the letters where Cicero seems to be quoting Atticus's Greek back to him. We've also labeled that as quotation. The example that you say of politeia, there's quite a big category of what we've called the Greek cultural sphere. So where Cicero uses words that seem to be particularly linked to areas or themes that seem to have a kind of particular significance in the Greek world. So like politics or architecture or art or philosophy or kind of literary and rhetorical terms. So I would imagine that we would have categorized that under kind of the Greek cultural sphere of politics, because Cicero does seem to use Greek political vocabulary quite a lot in the letters. But there are various other functions. I think there are about 25 in total. I'd have to double check. But they include things like metalinguistic functions as well, where Cicero uses Greek to characterize the way that somebody is speaking in Latin or Greek, and kind of he switches into Greek to reflect on that. Yeah, so I would be really happy to, that's a kind of short answer, shortish, sorry. But I would be really happy to kind of go through with you the function list and talk more about that. But hopefully that gives you enough of an answer for now.
Yes, thank you very much. Just a little one to understand it better. Is it possible to make a search through functions?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Okay.
So I can very quickly share my screen actually.
No, thank you, but I don't want to.
I'll very quickly share. So hopefully you can see it again. As you can see, you can search by function. That you'll get a whole drop-down list of all the functions available. And on the About tool up here, I think,
okay,
there's a list of what the functions mean.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Melanie. Sorry for the name. You have to explain me how to pronounce it.
That's fine, Lidewij.
Lidewij. Oh.
Anyway, so Olivia, thank you very much for your great talk. And I've read your book actually with Alex Mullen, and I saw your website. I think it's great. And I have two practical questions because of what you said. So I think the idea of the influence of other readers than the addressee, like you showed with Caesar, I mean, it cannot be emphasized enough that is something very relevant for the language used. And I was wondering, is it still possible to add the information in the database technically to include such third persons? Because often we know, of course, who is supposed to read the letter as well. So like you said, is it possible to add still this database and to do this kind of research?
That's a really good question. Yes, it technically should be possible. We haven't included that at the moment. So for the moment, the database just gives the kind of actual the real addressee, as it were. But certainly I think that's something that we could add, and I guess there are two ways of doing it. Either would be to add a new field, or it could be added within the kind of addressee field, or indeed it could also be added in the commentary field. So there's quite a lot of space for kind of free text there. So actually that might be one place where, particularly if you wanted to kind of make a hypothesis but weren't certain, that would be a good place to do that. But yes, technically it is possible.
But it's not possible at the moment for others to work on the database, is it?
No. So that is a thing that we'd like to, that is a thing we'd like to do. So what is possible is for other people to access the back end of the data, add to it and then upload it. But it's not possible for them to add to it online. So you can download data, but you can't upload data without having access to the back end of the website. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes. Yeah, I think that's a clever way also not to have people maybe messing around with your database online immediately. And
I think, yeah, it was a bit of a balance, because obviously at the moment we kind of wanted the data as it's presented, because as it's presented as our analysts have done it, but I think it's always a balance. So I think you know, we would definitely be really open for collaboration. So if people wanted to kind of get involved, and we'd definitely really happily collaborate with them and, you know, give access to the back end of the website. But I think at the moment we haven't done it in such a way that anybody can tinker with it online, which I guess is quite, But one of the reasons I was interested in coming to the conference was I'm really interested to see how others have managed it with kind of data sets and people being able to play with it and kind of the balance.
I would love to come back to that in another moment. And I have just another curiosity. Do you have examples of people, of researchers, students using your database already? Do they, and how does it work? Do you collaborate, or do they just use it and send you maybe their outcomes?
We have had a couple of people kind of get in touch and say, oh yeah, we've been using it for this reason.
Right.
I think
it works.
Yeah, I hope so. I think one of the things that's quite nice is that because you can kind of break down the data in various different ways. I know with some of my own, I haven't yet, but I know with some of my own students, it might be nice to be able to give them a set of data to actually work on, that's quite, you know, limited in scope. But yeah, I hope that it will be able to be kind of, and I'm really interested in ideas from people about how we can kind of extend the reach of it.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Last question from Christoph Piper, please.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Olivia. It was a really great talk and a great introduction to this project. I will surely have a look in it. I have just one question of let's say, content-wise. I found it very interesting that you find letters in which this code switching happens very often in moments where Cicero is in need of boosting his own ego up and making a bigger attempt in this self-fashioning thing. And I was just wondering how this finding would match with things which Karen Bishop at the moment has done. So how important Greek culture in general was for the general image of Cicero, because I think what you could add is that it adds this, so Caroline very nicely shows how in every literary genre he's writing in, the Greek is so massively important, but you can actually also show that obviously on the side of the respondents, there is this embedding of this so that it works, that it is not out of the nothing, out of the blue, but that it is really within a context where obviously Greek is used as a kind of, or can be used and can be understood also by others as a kind of boosting up methods. It's perhaps more a comment than a question, but I found it very, very inspiring.
Oh, thank you very much. That's really kind. And no, I think it's really interesting that you bring that up. A couple of things I would say there is one of the things I think is really interesting is you can isolate the Greek that Cicero is quoting from others. And I think I can't remember the figure, so I'm not going to say, but a reason, and there is a proportion of the Greek that actually in the letters appears to be Cicero reusing and requoting the Greek of other people, which I think is really good evidence for just how kind of widespread the use of Greek in this Roman society is. The other thing is that I've focused my work on code switching, but I think that one thing that would be really interesting to do, I'm not sure that it would be possible within this database, but there potentially would be options for thinking about how to link up with other digital tools, would be to make a comparison between Greek code switching and other Greek phenomena in the letters. And I think that would be a really cool thing to do, because there are other Greek linguistic phenomena like borrowings, or kind of just, you know, Greek names and things. And so I think that would be a really interesting thing to kind of map how much Greek is going on. But thank you very much for your question and comment.
Any other question? I think not. So if there aren't any other questions, we can thank again Olivia for her great presentation and move to the second speaker of the morning. I'm the worst with names, sorry. So I want to make sure I get your name right. How do you say it? Mareike?
Mareike.
Mareike, okay.
Yes, perfect.
With Mareike Krab, we are going to leave classical antiquity for a moment and move a little further into Renaissance. Mareike Krab graduated in 2009 from KU Leuven. Writing her master thesis on Justus Lipsius on Livius, she developed a particular interest in the field of Neo-Latin studies and in the history of classical philology. Consequently, she pursued that interest in her PhD thesis about printed the Renaissance commentary on Valerius Maximus, successfully defended in 2014. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow of the Research Foundation Flanders, and her most recent research topic has been the Fortuna Suetonius life of 12 Caesars in the Renaissance, of course, and the early modern reception of Cicero letters. Today, she is going to present a paper about this second research topic. The title of her paper is Cicero, Man of Letter, the reception of Cicero epistle in the Renaissance, and I give her the floor.
Thank you very much. I'll start by sharing my screen. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you so much for having me. I must confess that I don't feel entirely at ease because I'm not an expert in digital humanities, nor even a Ciceronian scholar in the sense that I do not study Cicero himself, but rather the ways in which he was read and appreciated in later times, more specifically in the Renaissance of the 15th and 16th centuries. This might be a bit out of your comfort zone as well, so at least I'm in good company. Now, I'd like to start my presentation with a quote from Zielinski's important book on Cicero through the ages. Way back in 1897, Zielinski famously wrote that the Renaissance was first and foremost a revival of Cicero, and only after him, and thanks to him, of the rest of classical antiquity. This is obviously exaggerated, but one cannot possibly overestimate the cultural importance of Cicero in the early modern period. All humanists were avid readers of his speeches and of his treatises on philosophy, rhetoric, and law. Moreover, they regarded him as a political role model, admired his literary genius, and enthusiastically imitated his style. As Cicero's afterlife is one of the most varied and wide-ranging of any classical author, scholars wishing to study his reception are invariably confronted with what Altman described as simply too much of Cicero to master. Paradoxically, but also quite understandably, the overwhelming amount of relevant source materials has hindered rather than stimulated exhaustive research efforts. And even though scholarship in this field is booming, the Renaissance Cicero has still not received attention proportionate to his importance. In order to help fill this gap, I am currently conducting a research project entitled Cicero, Man of Letters, the reception of Cicero's epistles in the Renaissance, which focuses, as said, on his reception in the late 15th and 16th centuries, and on a single work, namely the Letters, which had been out of sight during the Middle Ages and were rediscovered in the 14th century. Why the Letters? First, because they show us Cicero not only as a statesman or politician or rhetorician or philosopher, but also as a literator and above all as a human being. As such, they were all important for the humanist appreciation of Cicero. Secondly, because it is well known that they played a key role in the humanist educational program and acted as important style models for humanist letter writing. And thirdly, because in spite of their obvious omnipresence and importance, they have hardly been studied and certainly not in a systematic way. My goal is thus to offer the first comprehensive study of the letters' transmission and reception in the Renaissance by approaching them from a very specific perspective, that is, by undertaking a systematic study of all printed editions of the letters from the Editio Princeps in 1467 all the way to 1600. Why the printed editions? Because it is often forgotten that the humanists, just like ourselves, did not read texts, but books. And from 1470 onwards, these were mostly printed books, which were distributed all over Europe in nearly identical copies. Interestingly, these printed books contained not only the actual text of Cicero's letters, but also a number of paratexts, such as dedicatory letters, letters to the reader, ancient testimonia on Cicero, humanist biographies of Cicero, and so on. which were designed to guide the reading, interpretation, and use of Cicero's letters, and which conveyed a specific image of Cicero and his work. This goes in particular for the many humanist commentaries printed along with his letters, which were added precisely to explain, interpret, or correct the ancient text. So by studying the letters' printing history, it should be possible to get a good idea of their transmission, when and where Cicero's letters were printed, by whom, for whom, and why, which collections or books of letters were read more than others, in which language, either Latin or one of the vernaculars, as well as their reception, how the letters were read and interpreted in this period, which image of Cicero they spread, and whether the obvious attention given to the formal aspects of Cicero's letters was matched by interest for their content. Now, this is a project that could not be accomplished without the use of digital resources, or at least not by a single researcher in the span of 3 years, which is still quite optimistic considering that it concerns over 1,000 editions. So what I would like to do in the remaining 25 minutes is to explain in detail how I went about collecting, organizing, and interpreting the source materials, with special attention to the methods followed, the digital resources used, and the planned digital output, and highlighting the exciting new possibilities as well as the limitations. And in whatever time is left, I will present to you some first findings of my study of the editions printed printed up to 1550 to demonstrate the sort of results to be expected. So basically, this is just a personal testimony of the ways in which digital humanities helped me do my research. Just one short remark before I actually finally start. When I first started to do this kind of research, there was no approved methodology for doing so. And I just learned as I went along, sharing ideas and discussing my practices with like-minded scholars. One of them is Craig Kellendorf, who has written extensively on the reception of Virgil and has recently published this book, which nicely demonstrates the method followed and shows not only how challenging, but also how rewarding this kind of research can be. He too stresses that there is no denying that the digital revolutions offers the potential to do better work more quickly than ever before. Yet he also points out possible pitfalls. In what follows, I will include some of his visions too, but if you're interested in the subject, this is certainly worth reading. In order to be able to study all extant printed editions of the letters, it is of course essential to first have a list of them that is as complete as possible. This would have been quite a job before the age of digital humanities, since the books are scattered throughout libraries all over the world, and you would have had to compile information from a wide range of bibliographical sources. Nowadays, however, much of this information can be accessed together through the Universal Short Title Catalog. I'm not sure whether you are familiar with the USTC, but it is an amazing tool. It is, as you can see here, a digital bibliography of early modern print culture, which aims to list every book printed from the invention of printing in the early 1450s up until 1650, and they are currently expanding to 1700. Let's just go to the website. As you can see in this search window, you can search the database for author, title, imprint, printer, place, region, format, subject, a language, but also here date, or you can retrieve editions with a specific USTC reference number. So let's now, if it will work. Okay, we have a bit of trouble loading a search screen. Yes, okay, let's try. If we look for editions authored by Cicero, of which the title contains texts, which are printed between 1467 and 1600. Okay, search. you see that this search generates 1006 results, which you can then sort by, for instance, a date, or you can apply further filters. For example, you could just show the editions printed in Latin. Every edition has a page of its own with its unique reference number at the top. Next comes information concerning the author, the short title, and so on. Below, you can find any available digital copies, a list of known physical copies, and then further bibliographic references to the underlying catalogs. What is wonderful about the USCC is that it provides easy access to a mass of information, which is in fact fairly complete. It has ample options for searching and filtering, as well as direct links to other reference works and reproductions. And not unimportantly, it has a unique identifier for each edition, which comes in handy if you want to cite it. However, the USCC has its shortcomings as well. For me, these mainly concern the ways in which you can search the USCC. The search engine, which I showed you, looks fairly straightforward. And if you're looking for a particular edition, that's relatively easy to find. What is much more difficult, however, is to obtain as complete a list as possible of editions of one particular author or work, for a number of reasons that are well explained by Freya Cox-Jensen in the article cited here, but of which I will discuss here only two. Namely that USCC is a short title catalog, meaning that it gives only the short title of the editions. So if Cicero's letters are included in editions simply entitled Opera Omnia Ciceronis, these may not appear in the list. Moreover, not all hits are relevant. For example, the search I performed earlier also brings up this item, which is a 1544 Cologne edition of Vives's Handbook on Letter Writing, where Cicero is listed as an additional author when he was in fact just one of Vives's sources. The problem is just that it is quite impossible to find all relevant results in one single search. Consequently, it is also impossible to have all relevant results in one single list and make adequate use of these wonderful filters. And secondly, all found data should be verified and interpreted, and one should think very carefully about what to include and what not. By having a closer look at the books themselves, I have come across some additional problems with the USCC, which also contains a number of double entries, as what turns out to be one and the same edition is listed twice. Bibliographical ghosts, that is, editions for which no physical copy is known and which just may or may not exist. There are a few omissions, few, but some. Much more common and also inevitable, I guess, are small mistakes that can only be brought to light and remedied by checking the book itself. For example, when a mistake is made in transcribing the Roman date, or when no physical copy seems to be present in the said library, or when it is present but has a different shelf mark, or when a digital copy is attached to the wrong physical item, so to say. Now, such errors were often already present in the original catalogs and simply copied into the USCC without double checking. When detecting one, I always inform both the library in question and the USCC. And although they are usually most grateful for any corrections and additions, they simply don't have the time to immediately correct those mistakes. A final issue is that the USCC does not have an export button, so to speak. It is not possible to export data en masse, but you have to copy paste every single item you're interested in, which is not very user-friendly. I know that Freya Cox-Jensen, whom I just cited, that she was able to work directly with the data in, or should I say the data behind the USCC. And she told me that there is actually much more information available in the background than what is visible to the website's users. But she actually had to travel to St. Andrews for that, where the website is hosted. And then she was made to sit in an entirely empty room without internet access or even a USB's flash drive. And believe it or not, they eventually printed out the data that she wanted on paper. So at least back in the time, they were quite protective. Anyway, the USTC is a wonderful tool which enables scholars to do research that would not have been possible 20 years ago. And if you just want to have a general idea of how many editions of a given work were printed, where and when, that's fine. But if you really need detailed information for statistical research, you should proceed with caution. For different users, asking one and the same question will most probably come up with slightly different results. So just make sure to perform complex and intelligent searches, double check all of the data, using also other more specialized catalogs and seeing as many of the editions as possible yourself. Given the limitations imposed by the USTC, in order to make the data usable, I had no other option than to compile my own list of relevant editions with the parameters that were important for my own research. Initially, I used an Excel file, but that turned out inadequate because I had so many data and I also wanted to link them. So eventually I decided to construct a relational FileMaker database. Or to be honest, I had one constructed for me by the Leuven Trismegistos team, which was mentioned also yesterday, who also host my database on their server. They do the maintenance and they offer technical support. So far, this database has served for personal use only, but it should be quite easy to convert into a simple website somewhere in the future, because obviously I do want to share my work with interested colleagues. So let me just show you what the database looks like. Mind you, you're getting a unique look behind the scenes now, and you didn't even have to travel to Leuven for that. The provisional title of my database is simply Cicero Man of Letters. It currently has 422 records, one for every edition I found for the period up until 1550. You see that every edition has a unique idea. Immediately below is indicated whether or not I have seen a copy of this edition myself, either in person or using digital reproductions, which are listed bottom right, also with a direct link to the website. Bottom left then comes the corresponding USTC number or numbers, since it is important to stress that the relationship is not one-on-one. When identical items are listed twice in the USTC, I obviously gave them but one number. The same goes for editions printed in multiple volumes, as well as different states of one and the same edition. And I might need to explain this a bit further, perhaps using this record. In the 16th century, printers operating within one and the same city often cooperated to produce one edition, sharing both the costs and the risks. Such editions existed in different states, which are identical apart from their title page, each of which mentions the name of one of these printers only. In the USTC, these are counted as 3 different items. But as some editions existed in 4 or 5, even up to 8 different states, I believe that the overall statistics risk getting distorted, for in the end it concerns only one moment of transmission and reception. Also different from the USTC, I tried to distinguish very clearly between various people behind the book, namely any editors, translators, commentators, or contributors of other paratexts, and of course the printer, which is mentioned here together with the date and the place of publication. Moreover, while the USTC offers only limited information on the actual contents of the editions, the fields here in the middle indicate not only the language of publication, but also which collections of Cicero's letters were included, sometimes also more in detail which letters, with which additional paratexts, and finally there is space for some personal notes. Using all of this information in the database, one can easily reconstruct the transmission of the Cicero epistles editions, examining, for instance, when Cicero's letters were printed, how many editions there were every year, every 5 years, or every decade, as you can see here. It is also interesting to see where Cicero's letters were printed, in which city, or as in this chart, in which country. You see that by far most editions were printed in Italy, France and Germany, and quite surprisingly, none at all in Spain. Looking at the language of publication, it is apparent that Cicero's letters were almost always read in Latin. Only 5% of the editions contained vernacular translations into French, Italian, and Greek, and another 3% were bilingual, containing both the Latin version and the Italian or French and German translation. One can also easily establish which letters were read more than others. The chart on the left shows that about 2 in 3 printed editions contained the full text of one or more of Cicero's letter collections. And on the right-hand side, you see that the vast majority of those involved the letters ad familiares, whereas those to Brutus, Quintus, and Atticus were far less popular. And the same ratio can be seen within editions containing only selected letters or accepted phrases. Even more interestingly, one can combine these features and study, for instance, the geographical distribution of the editions over time. In this chart, you see that Italy held center stage in the incunabulum period, while Germany produced a remarkable number of editions between 1510 and 1530, after which date France became the most important country. Or the number of vernacular editions over time, as is done in this chart, which clearly shows that there was a limited number of bilingual Latin-Italian editions before 1500, not a single vernacular version until 1530, and quite an explosion around 1550 of mainly French translations, which nicely matches the geographical distribution. And you could do the same for all other parameters. Though here too, we should proceed with caution, bearing in mind that, for instance, the place where a book is printed is not necessarily where it was sold or read. The fact that a book was printed does not necessarily mean that it was sold, or if it was sold, that it was read at all. Also, these figures do not take into account the number of copies printed of each edition, nor works still circulating in manuscript form, nor books in the second-hand market. But above all, these figures tell us nothing about the actual contents of the books or which Cicero was being read. So in addition to the letter's printing history, it is essential also to study the form and contents of the individual editions, as well as the evolution in their layout or print presentation. This too, I had not been able to do without the use of digital resources, as the evidence is dispersed in libraries throughout the world, and some editions have survived only in 1 or 2 copies. Before the age of digital humanities, one would have had to do a lot of traveling to see all of these books. But now ever more libraries are having their special collections digitized, and lots of materials have become available through projects such as Early English Books Online or Google Books, which turned out a really good thing last year when libraries suddenly closed and stayed closed for a long time. Before the first lockdown, I had only one short research stay at the British Library, but the rest of my research was actually done from home, and I've still been able to see 224 of the editions listed so far, so slightly over half. So obviously, digital copies are invaluable when working with early printed editions, because you have easy access to a mass of material from all over the world. And sometimes you can even download the reproduction and annotate the PDF, whereas you'd be banned for life from a library if you ever did that to a physical copy. However, there are some downsides to working with digital copies as well. For example, reading a book on your computer screen is not that different from having a Zoom conference. It's practical, it works, but the experience is just not the same, especially when you're studying the ways in which books were read. It's really nice to be able to hold the book yourself and feel it. Also, not all books were digitized with equal diligence. Sometimes pages are missing from the digital copy or put in the wrong order. These are, of course, just minor quibbles, but there is a risk that at some point in the future, people will have become so accustomed to having digital access to these kinds of materials that they forget about the real books and act as if what is not digitized does not exist or is not worth studying. The last step of my research, which in reality takes up probably most of my time, I will discuss here only very briefly because there are no further digital tools involved. In order to map out Cicero's reception, I just applied a traditional old school philological method of careful close reading of all the paratexts in all of these editions, especially the dedicatory letters, any letters to the reader, as well as any commentaries. By studying the successive editions, not only on sich, but also in relation to one another and as part of a bigger tradition, it is possible, I believe, to reconstruct the chain of receptions and to reach some wider conclusions about the ways in which Cicero's letters were read and interpreted over a longer period of time all over Europe by an ever wider readership. Now, I had promised to present to you by way of conclusion some of the intermediate results of my research project, and as time is running out, I will limit myself here to the question of whether the obvious attention given to the formal aspects of Cicero's letter was matched by an interest for their content. Generally speaking, Cicero's letters were indeed often read and used as stylistic and literary models for letter writing. This is most obvious in the many editions that stemmed from and were used in humanist education. The link to the schools was already apparent from the places of publication, as such editions were not only printed in major cities, but also produced very locally, as well as from the predominant use of Latin. Looking at the books themselves, it is also visible from the many dedicatory letters to pupils and schoolmasters, from the fact that some of them, like the copy shown here, have extra wide spacing for easy annotation in class, and from the numerous partial editions, which contain a selection of Cicero's shorter and more elegant letters, which the pupils were expected to memorize and imitate in their own writing. But also outside of this immediate school context, several editions contained little introductions to letter writing or a table indicating where a reader might find good examples of letters of consolation or recommendation or complaint. Throughout the paratext, Cicero was time and again presented as the preeminent source and model of Latin eloquence, and his style of letter writing was praised as copious, elegant, facile, and pleasant. However, in 1526, the editor Nicolaus Sculcius reminded those blinded by love of Cicero that in antiquity, his style of letter writing had not met with unanimous approval. Cicero himself admitted that the style of his letters is very different from that of his speeches and not very special compared to other writers. Whether Cicero was considered as the only model worth following, and I'm referring now to the vehement debate on Ciceronianism, is less clear. It is often stated that students should drink from the source rather than from the streams, and once Cicero is compared to the sun around which circle the other planets. However, especially in school editions, his letters were printed alongside those of other classical authors, particularly Pliny, and exceptionally also modern writers, of which some were true Ciceronians, yet other favored an eclectic style. So were Cicero's humanist readers also interested in the contents of his letters? For sure, albeit perhaps to a lesser extent. They did realize, for example, that the letters to Atticus offer a privileged look into the times of Cicero, since the author himself was not only witness to, but also played an important role in the affairs of the Roman Republic. Moreover, several commentaries offer historical introductions, and many editions include Cornelius Nepos' Vita Attici, as well as Plutarch's Life of Cicero, which is, however, not very laudatory, nor is Petrarch's famous letters to Cicero that is sometimes printed with the Ciceronian letters. The popularity of the letters to Cicero's wife Terentia and his secretary Tiro prove that Cicero's humanist readers were also concerned with Cicero himself as a person, as a statesman, as a man. Yet, surprisingly, few humanist editors included Vita Ciceronis of their own. Finally, some editions present Cicero's first letter to Quintus as a mirror for princes and a handbook for good and wise rulers, which demonstrates that the letters were not only seen as a historical document, but also read from a moral and political perspective. Now, this was very short and generalizing, and if you'd like to find out more, just let me know. In conclusion, well, I don't have a major conclusion, so here are just some nice pictures I took in the British Library. I just hope that I have been able to give you a clear picture of my research project and the digital tools and methods employed, highlighting their potential as well as their limitations. And above all, I hope to have demonstrated that in the age of digital humanities, it is finally possible to overcome the abundance of too much of Cicero to master. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation, for bringing us further into history, not only in classical antiquity, but also in the Renaissance. Are there any questions? Maybe, please. Okay, Christoph Piper, please.
Thank you, Mareike, for this great talk. I have one very detailed question and a very broad one, I guess. The detailed question would be, you were saying that many of these editions are school editions. Is that also, well, is this related to the fact that we have such a huge amount of ad familiaris letters? So in other words, are the ad familiaris letters more often school editions than the, for example, Atticus letters, which perhaps would be read more as a historical document, or do these school editions cover all of these? And how many, how could you already give a kind of percentage of how many of your 400, what was it, 60 things you have could be classified as school editions? And my second question, the broad one, is about, as you know, that interests me a lot, Cicero as a kind of political person, a historical person. So you say there are not many written biographies of Cicero at the beginning of the edition, but perhaps in the prefaces, nevertheless, people reflect on Cicero's not only renown as a stylistic model, but also as a kind of well, personal model for living a good humanistic life. Do you find that relatively regularly or not so much?
Okay, I'll start by answering the first question. Yes, there is definitely a relationship between the number of school editions and the huge number of ad familiaris editions. I don't think that I've come across any editions of the letters to Atticus only, which was meant specifically for the schools. So it is true that in the schools it was the letters ad familiaris that were read. However, there is also an important number of editions with selected letters. As I said, these were usually well, they were presented as shorter letters, more elegant letters, the kind of thing you could easily memorize. Most of them are taken from the familiaris as well, but we have an important number of editions which take letters from the other collections as well. And it would be very interesting to see which letters, to Atticus were included, for example, in this kind of school editions. Because interestingly, perhaps maybe also to link to the previous paper, which was about the use of Greek in Cicero's letters. This is exactly, one of the reasons given by humanist editors why they exclude the letters to Atticus, or when they print them, they all say, well, these are more difficult letters for a number of reasons, but also because they contain a lot of Greek, because they were more intimate, because you needed more background information, more knowledge of Cicero's own life. But also, the use of Greek was an important factor there, why they were excluded from the school editions. And then as to your second question, I think that's a very good suggestion. I mean, if there are no relatively few humanist biographies included, you would expect the editors or commentators or translators to reflect on this in their prefaces, but they usually don't, or they do it in a very general manner. And usually they say, and now I'm really generalizing, but they say Cicero was not only an eloquent, but also a very wise man. So these are the two elements that you do often find together. But there are no detailed reflections on Cicero as a political role model, and I still find this quite surprising. I had hoped to encounter more of this, but it is Yeah, they're not very explicit on this aspect. Hopefully that answers both of your questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Great.
Okay. Another question from Olivia Elder.
Thank you very much for your paper. I also have two questions. One, I'm sorry to ask about the Greek, but since you brought it up, I just wondered, you said that they find the Greek difficult. When they do print the Greek and kind of, when they do bring themselves to print the Greek, how good a job do they make of the Greek? And do they actually print it in Greek letters, or do they transliterate it back into Latin script? Kind of what happens in script? And then my more general question, you mentioned the kind of your use of digital resources during lockdown, and I just wondered whether you'd noticed over the past year an improvement in digital resources, or whether you were relying on existing digital resources that happened to already be in place, or whether you actually saw that kind of COVID and the lockdowns had been a driver of better digital editions.
Okay, as to your first question, I think it's just a very general trend in Cuneiform editions. So those printed up until 1500, you really see printers struggling with the Greek types. So in the first editions, either the Greek is printed, but there is just a bunch of Greek characters. Often you cannot even make out which word there should be, or the space is just left blank, and the actual buyers of the editions were supposed to fill in the lacunas. And then after a while, I mean, this gets better, and the Greek is actually printed. But it's something I haven't paid attention to, but will from now on, is how they deal with the Greek in the commentaries, for example. I assume that they just try to translate it, but it might be nice actually to explore this a little bit further. And then as to the digital resources, I just kept using the resources I already knew. I haven't really noticed a change in that. But, and this is just my personal experience, I did notice a change in the way people do business. I have had more contacts with more international colleagues than even, than usually. Of course, all physical events were cancelled, but we really have, explored these digital tools, and instead of writing an email, or like, let's just have a Zoom conversation, also, more informal, and this has helped advance my research, but it's just a consequence, I think, and I hope it's something that will last, because I really liked the fact that you were talking about these collaborative projects, and that this is really not only an excellent way of doing research, but also a very nice way. And that's, of course, very different from what I've been doing all by myself. But also that's something I'd look forward to in the future, to doing more of this kind of collaborative research.
Justin Stover.
Thank you, and I hope you don't mind that I'm not going to inflict my video on you. Thank you for that paper. It's really very inspiring. I had two closely linked queries for you. When you're working on these printed editions, what kind of data are you recording for each edition that you look at? What kind of bibliographic and physical details about the individual books? And secondly, related to that, having looked at more than 200 editions of one text from a 75-year period, what do you have any observations about the evolution and consistencies of printing practice in that period from the first printed editions to 1550 or beyond?
Wow, the second one is a very difficult question, also very interesting one. Yes, I have, but it's difficult to give you any specific examples right now. But it is true that if you're studying these huge numbers of editions, often also studying more, several copies of one and the same edition, and doing so in a chronological way, you can really trace evolutions in print presentations, or in the the presence of commentaries or one or more commentaries. So actually almost for all of the parameters included in my database, I could, well, I could describe the evolution, but considering that it considered so many evolution additions, so many data, it's difficult to, to do so extempore. I would have to look at the data again. And this actually brings me to your first question, because, yeah, well, I said that the USTC actually has much more data than what is available in the database. And of course, the same goes for me as well, in a way, because, when studying these editions, I have made careful notes about their contents, like, which texts, which paratexts are present on which pages. And then often I also made a transcription or a translation just for myself. But I also described their layout, for example. I mean, this edition has a commentary. Is it printed surrounding the source text, following the source text, which format is used, which font is used. But it's a lot of information, and I struggled with, what should I include in the database, because I mainly wanted to include things that would be searchable for other readers. So not if, maybe I have a 5-page description of an edition, but then my question is, what kind of information do I include in the database? Because, it can be standardized in some way. So it's far from perfect, and it's far from finished, but well, I hope to be able to continue a little more.
Any other questions?
Sì, ce n'è uno di Gianmario.
Ah, non l'ho visto. Prego, Gianmario. Microfono. Il microfono spento.
Thank you very much, Mareike, for your presentation, and congratulations for your project. I got just one small question about the section of your database. Are you planning also to insert a section in which you will register or simply list the most relevant owner or annotator or scholars of a specific copy? Because I would find it very useful, because when we start to study a specific humanistic Renaissance scholar, it's always useful to know what kind of text, what edition he was reading. I know that it's a very, maybe at a second moment in the future, you will be able, after collecting all the other data that are more significant. But for example, I don't know, Erasmus, Lipsius, or Italian humanists, it would be very, very interesting. It has been done for Pinaces, for the manuscript, the Greek manuscript, the catalog of Greek manuscript, in which there is a section with, of course, copies, because we're talking about manuscript, but also owners. So it's interesting that maybe through your database, we can also have like a quick look into the libraries of this. Of course, it's very difficult, at sometimes it's quite impossible, but for me, it would be very useful if in the future it will be possible.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very interesting suggestion. That would, of course, require that I have different records for the different copies as well, but I guess that technically that should all be possible. Sadly, I have to disappoint you. I mean, I've studied hundreds of copies so far. I haven't come across any owned by a famous humanist. Mostly, it's just if there is any indication of authorship at all, it usually concerns well, schools and gymnasia and so on. So I'm afraid that I have to disappoint you. I cannot come up with a very exciting example of ownership. But yes, it's something I find very interesting as well. So I'll keep that in mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Other questions? I think not. That's all. Okay. If that's all, we can thank again both Olivia and Mareike for their presentation and for the fruitful discussion of the morning. Direi quindi passo all'italiano, cambio improvvisamente lingua e passo all'italiano perché il nostro keynote speaker della mattinata è un amante della lingua italiana e anche un amico della lingua italiana. Parlerà in inglese, ma capisce molto bene l'italiano e lo parla anche molto meglio di quello che pensa. Allora, per me è un grandissimo piacere e anche un onore presentarvi Michael Hillen. Michael Hillen è l'11° Generalredakteur del Thesaurus della lingua latina, una carica iniziata nel 1899 con Friedrich Vollmer e arrivata fino a lui. Michael Hillen si è laureato in filologia classica presso l'Università di Bonn nel 1988 e successivamente è entrato al Thesaurus, dove ha percorso le tappe della carriera interna fino a diventarne nel 2014 il redattore, il generalredattore. Ogni generalredattore della storia del Thesaurus, che è una storia che dura da più di un secolo, si trova ad affrontare anche un mondo diverso e quindi a guidare il Thesaurus, che è questa impresa enorme, in fasi della storia diversa. Il mondo cambia, ma il Thesaurus vorrebbe, cercherebbe, o sarebbe bene di rimanesse sempre lo stesso, potremmo dire. Le sfide che sta affrontando Michael Hillen come generalredattore sono tante, naturalmente, e davvero notevoli. Le prime sono scientifiche, come vi dirà sicuramente meglio lui. Il Thesaurus è arrivato attualmente a Re, quindi la sua direzione sta vedendo la realizzazione di lemmi come res publica, tanto per dire i primi due che mi vengono in mente, che sono imprese enormi. Esistono però anche sfide storiche, ed è questa la ragione per cui noi l'abbiamo invitato e siamo molto contenti di averlo qui con noi. Sfide storiche che sono inevitabili in un progetto che dura da così tanto. Michael sta quindi iniziando a guidare il Thesaurus in una transizione digitale. Una transizione digitale che tuttavia deve essere intelligente e rispettosa della storia del Thesaurus. Spesso anche noi che stiamo parlando oggi parliamo molto spesso delle trasformazioni, come se il nuovo fosse assolutamente meglio del vecchio. In questo caso probabilmente siamo tutti d'accordo che no, anche perché loro lavorano con dei materiali che sono a loro volta storia, quando utilizzano il loro archivio o le varie zettel. Per loro è sì materiale di lavoro, ma è anche un reperto storico, quindi è un tipo di lavoro unico. Dicevo, sicuramente però il Thesaurus sta cercando di allinearsi ai tempi, tante cose molto interessanti sono state fatte negli ultimi anni che si devono a Michael. Ad esempio il Thesaurus è in open access, esiste una versione a pagamento con una maschera di ricerca molto avanzata, offerta dalla casa editrice De Gruyter, questa a pagamento, ma esiste anche la possibilità di scaricare i PDF gratuitamente dal sito del Thesaurus. Questi PDF sono poi stati utilmente inseriti in Diogenes, che è la maschera di ricerca per i database della letteratura latina creata da Peter Eslin ad Aram, che nella sua nuova release, nella sua nuova versione, offre anche la possibilità di cliccare su una parola e di vedersi e aprire immediatamente la pagina del Thesaurus. Un connubio che è davvero molto utile. C'è poi una terza iniziativa molto interessante che speriamo possa riprendere, cioè la Summer School. Da qualche anno a questa parte il Thesaurus organizza una Summer School dedicata prevalentemente a giovani, e anche giovani e meno giovani, che stanno una settimana a Monaco, una settimana al Thesaurus e imparano il lavoro del lessicografo. Impararlo in una settimana credo sia un po' utopistico, però assaggiano, ecco, quel che è il lavoro al Thesaurus. Ho tenuto però per ultimo il pezzo forte, cioè se qualcuno ci dovesse dire, ma ce lo dicono spesso, dove pensate di andare col latino o il greco, la risposta vera è sulla prima pagina del New York Times. L'anno scorso, anzi forse 2 anni fa, vi sto condividendo lo schermo, Michael e il Thesaurus sono finiti sulla prima pagina del New York Times, e che ha fatto di questa storia una cover story. Era proprio è stato bellissimo, la copertina, dedicando un articolo molto bello e una serie di foto che sono stupende, lo consiglio, basta cercare New York Times, Thesaurus, lingue latine, proprio per far capire anche al pubblico americano, per raccontare la storia di questo dizionario infinito, no? la cattedrale, la Sagrada Famiglia della filologia classica, l'opera che continua negli anni sempre più grande, sempre più bella. Basta, mi sono dilungata troppo, quindi cedo senz'altro la parola a Michael Hillen, che ci parla, tiene una relazione su, adesso leggo, mi sono persa il titolo perché ho aperto la pagina del New York Times. Scusate, qualcuno mi aiuti col titolo che ho aperto la pagina del New York Times. Eccomi. Allora, qui. Attualmente quousque tandem from the birth of TLL Zettel Archive to a digital workflow by example of Cicero. E gli cedo senz'altro la parola.
Grazie Alice, mille grazie per la tua introduzione molto gentile e molto sorprendente. Io non ho aspettato di vedere la New York Times front page here. I thought it was for my grandchildren, which do not exist finora. Ma è una cosa incredibile. Kathleen Coleman from Harvard informed me about this front page. And she said, Michael, this is more than a classicist can achieve in a normal life. And yeah, you know which guys in this time appeared on these pages normally. I don't want to be compared to these guys in any case. So thank you for this hint. And yes, at a conference about, but I let you see my, well, so at a conference about Cicero Digitalis, it's difficult for me as a really digital layman in general, and as a thesaurus in particular, to talk about a digital or digitized or still to be digitized Cicero separately, because Cicero is always included in the subject of a thesaurus linguae latinae digitalis. The existing digital thesaurus is being created under the technical and economic responsibility of de Gruyter, as you told us. We, as the TLL, have put in open access with PDFs, TLL online since 2019 with a moving wall of 3 years for the 125th anniversary of the thesaurus. That means the 125th anniversary of the beginning of the actual work at Munich. But this open access is technically, that is digitally, still at a relatively low level, as critics say, but we have, after 2019, got better feedback from all over the world. But nevertheless, our open access allows online consultation of the TLL, that is the letters A till M, O, and N up to the lemma nebel, from Nemo to Nemos, and R up to Regno, especially in the time that the ETLL is inaccessible since weeks because de Gruyter is installing a relaunch. Indeed, even de Gruyter themselves refer to the homepage of the TLL and gives the hint to use our open access. And a word about open access. Open access is open access. You don't pay for it. The data bank of de Gruyter is very expensive. And if you are not connected to a library which gives you access, you have to pay a lot of money, which in fact, most people don't do. And the question of digitalization at the TLL, of course, we work on the computer, use the various databases, mostly the Library of Latin Texts of Brill, and databases for inscriptions, and use the fantastic digital offerages of the Bavarian State Library, the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek. And we have ourselves a homepage that offers digitally to download a whole range of information and materials to anyone. I've put a photo of the first site. It's worthwhile to go there and search a little bit around. There are so many surprises in store. I will focus here on a historical review of first how the analog archive of the thesaurus, a paper database in fact, was created, and how the extensive works of Cicero were handled in the process. Second, which the problems of the current workflow are, and third, which problems a modern, much more digital workflow causes at the thesaurus. First, there have been a number of earlier attempts to create such a large-scale Latin dictionary. Finally, in 1894, the thesaurus was set up by the 5 German-speaking academies, which then existed. I compare on the right hand the annexal fascicle, which says that the TLL is edited ab Academii Societatibusque Diversarum Nationum. I think there are 40 now. The aim was to create a completely new lexicon to deal with the whole of Latin from the beginning down to late antiquity. The lower limit was fixed at the year 600, although Isidore of Seville from the earlier 7th century was included as a source of ancient material. Second, the work was to be based on a completely new archive of quotation slips. This archive would cover as far as possible all surviving texts, not just literature, but also technical words on medicine or law, inscriptions, graffiti, and so on, and be held in one place, the offices of the Thesaurus Linguae Latinae at Munich. These plans marked a clear departure from earlier lexica, which were mostly based on their predecessors and on the private study of a few individuals who gave their name to the work. For instance, Forcellini, Georges, produced by father Karl Ernst and son Heinrich. They expanded the existing lexica or their older editions through the fruits of personal reading in form of handwritten entries in margine of their own copies. These could then be incorporated into the next edition. I show you here an example of our library. We have the lexicon of Klotz, the Latin lexicon, used by Carl Friedrich Wilhelm Müller, and it shows his manuscript annotations in margine. He added important usages, important places, and evidence he found during his work. When I came to the TLL in the late 80s, the consultation of this book was obligatory for a young Mitarbeiter, and it is really hell to read it. It's not better if you have it in hand. It's a lot of work. Nowadays, we are acquainted to this work, and we know that the most things we find there is also in databanks, but a look is worthwhile always. In the early stages of planning Thesaurus Linguae Latinae, the idea was aired that all ancient sources of Latin from the 3rd century before Christ down to the year 600 should be covered in their entirety. That is, not merely every surviving text, but all the words in each text. Now it will be clear to everyone that this approach would have created a huge mass of material impossible to master in a reasonable length of time. Perhaps the thesaurus would have remained for almost 100 years, nothing more than a vast data bank on paper, and nowadays, in the age of electronic data banks, no one would have a word to say about it. Fortunately, after heated discussion, the founders of the thesaurus arrived at a compromise. The text down to Apuleius in the latter half of the 2nd century would be included as a whole. In other words, there would be slips recording every single occurrence of every word from this period, including res, non, ut, ne, etc. But as far as later texts were concerned, they would be read through by specialists in various fields, and excerpts would be made of whatever seemed unusual or striking. So I've made a diagram to show you the structure of our material. Oh, and yeah, it mentions the inscriptiones, which play, of course, a very important role in Latin, in a Latin lexicon like the TLL. For the Latin language testimonies up to and including Apuleius, the TLL's Zettelarchiv, the archive of slips, is an analogous text database and was a great progress at that time. In this form, the Thesaurus archive was and is still used by staff and guests, as you, Alice, and it's constantly being expanded. New founds are incorporated into the material. One prominent example is when in the city of London, one great bank erected a new building. In the hole they dug, they have found masses of wooden tablets from the 1st century after Christ, and of course they belong in the time till Apuleius. They have to be incorporated totally in our system. Okay, the slips would be based on the editions regarded at that time, towards the end of the 19th century, as the best and most authoritative. I will show you now how the production of the slips was organized and what the results look like. That is, the dictionary slips, which you all can make use of if you come to Munich. So here you see a page from Ribbeck's 1894 second edition of Virgil's Georgica, Book 2, verses 53 till 69. It was worked on in preparation for the slips by Friedrich Leo himself. It's heavily annotated, as you see, and if you have had more time, you would see that many informations of the apparatus criticus is written in margine. This process of preparation for the print or the production of the slips is called, with a strange, for me, for us nowadays, strange word, it's abkorrigieren, which means revise, correct, a little bit, but nothing is corrected. It's more preparation. In Latin, the TLL uses the word recognoscere. And this page was divided by red lines, and you see one here. The other one should be thought here, but it's on the foregoing pages. The text is divided into sections which correspond to the slips themselves produced by this book. So let's see here. This is, you see, nec non et, and it goes to respondent, nec non et, respondent. So let me explain a little bit about what you see. This is one zettel. You have a lemma here in this place on right above. Respondio. The lemma is indicated in nominating normal form. And here, respondent is underlined in red. This is the sign for the Mitarbeiter that he finds his lemma he's working on Respondio here. And there are some numbers. Number 19 is the order number of Virgil. And we have here 78. That means in this text of Virgil, we find 78 words. And that means this piece of text has been reproduced with all these annotations 78 times. On the first, we have an entry here on neck. On the second, an entry of known, and known is red underlined, and so on. And later, these settle have been distributed to the lemma boxes. And you see here more clearly that the annotation is not written in Latin cursive. It's in this German manner of writing. It's Sütterlin. It's a manner at the TLL very often that if you add something to a Latin text, you write in this to make the difference clear. It's a form of respect against the Latin literature. But not every corrector uses this manner of writing. So this is a typical zettel for the time till Apuleius. It shows a piece of text. It shows context, even if it's not very practical if you're at the end of the context and you don't see what follows, but you have to consult the edition. And now I go to text from the belonging to the period after Apuleius. This is only the text necessary for the Mitarbeiter to see and to find and consult in the edition. It's Rufin Adamantius contra Hereticus. He translated the work, and this is not enough to understand. So it's a little bit more work to do for the Mitarbeiter. So here you see Rufinus has the number 144. So here I've marked the 19 as the number of the author, and you see our actual manner of indicating this verse would be this form, and the Zettel doesn't bear this format. They had no idea what should happen later and fixed it at a very late time. Nowadays we write this here. Very important. And so, very important, the number top left is the reference number of the author. The material of every lemma in the archives is arranged according to these numbers. In other words, chronologically. Starting very often, of course, with inscriptions, Plautus or Ennius. If you leaf through the slips of a single lemma, you are making a journey through Latin literature. If you walk through the library of the TLL, beginning at the entrance door, you are making the same journey because the Latin authors are also arranged in chronological order. This is here. When you come in, and on the left side, you begin with Plautus and Terentius, of course. So, from the outset, there were slips not only for the texts themselves, but also for relevant secondary literature. I've made here a collection of secondary literature found in the box for the word nekesse. You see older ones and more actual ones, because the collecting of relevant literature did not stop in the year 1900. We are continuing to collect and search relevant literature and make it known to the Mitarbeiter. The process of making slips, as I said, continued and still continues after the publication of the first fascicle in the year 1900. Some later authors were given a complete coverage, and slips were also added for new word indexes and concordances, which is a little bit abundant nowadays. But this did make not a great difference to the principle of selectivity in the later period. Let's see. All this together means that the archives of the TLL contain extra information about words which have already appeared in print. These so-called addenda, we have three groups of addenda, Roman 1, 2, and 3, are kept separately from the basic material. This is a valuable and perhaps unknown feature of the TLL archives, which I give you a photo here. So we estimate that the archives you see here now contain about 10 million slips. As one single slips referring to a word index or concordance can lead to many examples, the number of instances of word covered will be much greater. Here is one really horrifying example. This is an Indexzettel for the Vocabularium Jurisprudentiae Romanae. And if you follow this hint, you come here with, I think, 100 places of Nekesse, nearly ordered. And yeah, it's, I call it, when I talk to students visiting us, that this zettel is a measure of mass destruction of time and energy. So you have to be prepared when you're beginning a word that you find these zettel and they enlarge the material you have to work on in seconds. Of course, you have not to put all the places shown here into your article. You have to decide whether or not, but you have to control them. That costs a lot of time. Now, I've already mentioned the very sensible decision to limit the amount of material for the later period. These days, of course, we have data banks, but their existence only makes even clearer the good sense of that decision. We lexicographers can certainly make use of data banks, and we do. And we should do in a very reluctant and cautious way, only when you have a well-defined purpose in mind. Otherwise, the huge amount of material they offer could lead to a serious waste of time or to articles too long. In terms of quantity, the slips in our archives obviously contain less than the data banks, but there are advantages of quality. First, not all our texts can be found in data banks, and many are unlikely to get into them for years to come, not having been edited in important series of publications. For example, we have a number of obscure medical texts or lives of saints which fall into this category. This means that the thesaurus sometimes has lemmata which are absent from all data banks. Second, the material of the thesaurus is lemmatized. That is, all the different forms of a word are kept together in the archives, which is very, very useful for both lexicographers and visitors. On the other hand, the slips for homonyms, such as the various words spelled P-I-L-A, pillar, a ball, pila, a mortar, pila, a pillar, are separated from each other. Third, the slips, as I've shown you, contain much useful information which you won't find in data banks. Firstly, an example of an inscription, which gives us a dating. Second, they give us the Greek original of a translation. This is a piece of the Itala, as it was called till the 60s. Now it's called Vetus Latina, and it's a very complicated range of lexicography. But here you don't find this combination in data banks. And we have here information about the manuscript tradition and a hint what Servius says on this verse. We find, as you have seen, perhaps in virtual variant readings, conjectures, editorial doubts of the transmitted text, and ideas or suggestions how to translate a word. As often, the Zettel has to be corrected by the Mitarbeiter in a first step. This genitive is not done in the TLL. We have to use these abbreviations. By the way, this last feature, the annotations on the slips, was originally intended to speed up the work by making it unnecessary for the lexicographers to consult editions. But we now regard it as essential to check the text against the latest editions and to look carefully at the apparatus criticus. We make new annotations in new editions. So this is the edition of Michael Winterbottom of Cicero's De Officiis. It appeared in 1994, and it has already annotations, which you find when you are sent by your Zettel to this piece of text. It's not clear what you find here in Revue de Philologique or in Würzburger Jahrbücher, but if it's important, you are very thankful to find it here. And the process of going to the bibliothèque to consult the new actual texts is a new step of work in comparison to the beginnings, and it takes time and energy. So how do we know, how does the interested user know which editions which edition the slips are based on, or who made the revision, the Abkorrektur of the excerpts? There are three sources. Firstly, the work diary of Eduard Wölfflin. You see here the two statues of him in front of the Thesaurus Library, who, along with Theodor Mommsen, was one of the great promoters of the TLL project, but also as Theodor Mommsen, a talented scientific organizer. As a member of the so-called Directorium, which acted from 1893 till 1899, he organized the Verzettelung, the production of the Zettel, which I would express in Latin, the Schedificatio. And he worked on prose in Munich. Poetry was organized in Göttingen, and later from Göttingen the material was transported to Munich. Fortunately, we have his work diary, and we are now taking a look inside. Perhaps you want to know why we have two identical statues. This one here is the original, and it has been found 5 years ago in the archives of a museum in Munich. The last 50 years, we had this gray guy. It's a copy in our institute. So we can't say goodbye to him, but perhaps one day he has to disappear in an archive. So we see the work diary of Cicero. You find here a number, and you see that Wölfflin worked already, of course, with the order number of the TLL. Cicero has the number 10. And of course, Cicero is divided in speeches, philosophical writings, rhetorical writings, and letters, and aratea, and so on. And the first entry is Lexikon von Merget abzukorrigieren. That means Hugo Merget, Lexikon zu den Reden Ciceros mit Angabe sämtlicher Stellen. It was written from 1877 till 1884. Was available for the TLL fathers, and it was based on the edition of Peter Kaiser. And here we find the information, die 8 Bände zum Zerschneiden und Aufkleben abgeben. Volumes given to be cut up and glued on. And for this practice, you need 2 examples, 2 copies of every book. So to produce the material of Cicero's speeches, they made no zettel on the first hand. They simply cut in pieces the index of Merget and glued it on zettel. You see here the first and the last zettel of Merget on the Orationes. It's here number 1, and there are 9 zettel made by this way. This procedure was also chosen for Caesar and Tacitus on the basis of the lexicon of Meusel and Gerbergrave. Back to Wölfflin. You see here, dated, the steps of the so-called Abkorrektur, the revision, which was entrusted to Professor Lutherbacher, otherwise unknown. Here is his name. He was a grammar school teacher, I think, in Bavaria. And here are the annotations that he worked through the edition of Kaiser, always indicating the fascicle. And we have here the annunciation that another person, Dr. Sattler, I don't know where he is and who he was, lost one of these books and lost the work invested by Lutherbacher. So the critical revision, nochmals, made by Professor Lutherbacher. So these are little errors and mistakes during the production of the zettel. So much shorter is the entry on Cicero's philosophical works. Here, it's indicated that the zettel should be based on the Müller edition of Teubner. And we'll read here Korrektur übernommen, correction, Abkorrektur taken by Professor Deiter in Aurich, which is in the north of Germany. But decisive is this information. Everything is noted, Lexikat geschnitten und aufgeklebt. So for the philosophical works, they followed the same practice as for the Orationes. It was zerschnitten, lexicon cut up and glued on paper. So we see it here. Again, many zettel, number 1 and number 8. And you see traces of the work of my Mitarbeiter who wrote the article Reliquus. But here we see information about the letters. Interesting, the editor of the epistles, Professor Mendelssohn, was the person who made the revision. So he was seen as the specialist who should do this work. Cicero ad Atticum was annotated by Professor Friedrich Leo, and E.W. is Eduard Wölflin, who did the work on Quintum Fratrem, at least of the first and the second book. The normal user of the thesaurus could briefly get this information from the first published fascicles. Here the pages concerning Cicero form the preface of volume 1, page Roman 6 and 7. We see here scriptores vel opera, the edition, ediderunt, recognoverunt, this is the abkorrektur, and excerperunt. Cicero is part of the first part of literature. So we had the edition of Friedrich, and the editor himself made the corrections. So, and we go here, and we find here the rest of the work, which does not correspond to the entry, totally to the entry in Wölflin's diary. And we see the total absence of the philosophical writings and the speeches. So they deemed it as sufficient to indicate in another place that the indices of Merget were used. Finally, in 1904, the first Index Liborum Scriptorum Inscriptionum ex quibus exemplar adferuntur said that in orationibus et philosophicis utimur lexicis mergueti, in rationibus ad editionem Baita Kaiser, in philosophicis ad editionem Müller confectis. So here it's open. And this is the state of affairs documented in the year 1904. These informations, of course, have not been taken into the second edition of the citation index of the year 1990. But as a thesaurist, I can tell you there are slips of the speeches and parts of the philosophical work. What happened? Users are informed relatively late, namely in the preface to volume Roman 5, Arabic 1, the letter D, which contains articles from the period from 1909 to 1934. And it shows us that even after the publication of the first fascicle in 1900, the text and material base of the thesaurus was expanded by excerpts. They are only excerpts. And page 7 shows us that we had ex recognoscentibus. So this is the terminus technicus, and it shows us that the Oxford Classical Text editions of Clark and Peterson were included after the publication, of course. So the production of the Zettel of Cicero fell into a gap between the old edition and the progressive editions of Oxford. So, but they were aware of this gap and filled it as soon as possible. So, and the same happened later with the philosophical works. To illustrate what the slip material of a concrete lemma like reliquus contains, I give you the following figures In the boxes of Reliquos, I found 270 slips of the speeches, like here. Let's begin with some information. You see the normal procedure. The number is Cicero is 10. We have the lemma we are dealing with. It's underlined in red. 77 copies from this pericope were made. And you see the annotation Clark. So the information of the apparatus of the OCT from 1909 is introduced into the Zettel. Of course, so this is another one. And you see here a new number till now absent. The thesaurus has introduced numbers for the chronological series of every part of Cicero's work. So this speech here has number 2. And you see traces of the Mitarbeiter. This is surprising for young guests. They see that you can write on this holy Zettel. So if it's useful and if you don't destroy the Zettel for the use of other people. So we have, okay, as I said, 270 slips of speeches, 80 slips of the Rhetorica, beginning with the Inventione, with the modern citation, and some annotations in Sütterlin. We have the Oratore, and we have 21 slips for De Republica, 44 for the Tusculanae, 29 for the De Officiis, and I show you a surprising Zettel from the Tusculanae, and a lot not on Zettel. I show you what happens in the case there's no Zettel. Here, surprisingly, for now, for our times, is the indication of the manuscripts used in the edition. Nowadays, this is not done. You have to rely on the edition you consult in our library. So this happens and has to happen when you have only Merge. You make your own Zettel. This is done here for De Natura Deorum. It's perhaps clear that this material structure with these indices was and is still very inconvenient for the Mitarbeiter because the Merge Zettel leave no space for annotations, often show no or too little context, and must therefore first be transferred into separate slips for the material you work on. In general, index slips make a lot of work. I have shown you with the example of the Vocabularium Jurisprudentiae, and they in fact occur mainly in the time after Apuleius. The TLL, Zettelarchiv, was without a competitive alternative for word research for more than 100 years, even though there were more and more word indexes and concordances for individual authors and text. For the proper lexicographic work in Munich, there was another ever-growing problem. The archive had been created in the belief and intention that the work could and should be completed within, don't laugh, 15 years. The fact that things turned out differently and had to turn out differently is due to, first, the fact that the prognosis had been made without any experience or possibility of comparison. Second, the fact that in the first years a dispute continued about the goal of the published thesaurus. Basically, it was a conflict between the idea of a pure representation of the material for further lexicographical work, or direct developed lexicographic technique and the presentation of a digested material. as we do it now since more than 80 years. I think the conflict ended in the 20s when Johann Baptist Hoffmann entered the collegium of the TLL. The problem is, the longer the project lasted, the more impossible or unacceptable was the unmodified and uncontrolled use of the slips, that is, without consulting the text editions, as I've told you already. More and more modern and better editions were produced and had to be consulted. Since decades, we check every slip against the authoritative edition we refer to in the 1990 index, the regularly published Addenda Indici, and for years in the online index, which is nowadays the best version of our index. This is an additional step. This consultation of the books in additional step in the workflow and costs time and energy. But as I said to you, it brings us into contact with references to important secondary literature that are entered into the edition to keep the material and the editions up to date. The TLL library itself represents, we can conclude, a much greater information value than the sum of the editions placed there. The modern text databases help us in our work, but not as much as one might think, because they do not contain all the text we cite, and they are not always based on the best editions. Only a few also show on Apparatus Criticus. The database of the Oxford Classical Text does, but it's not open access. And I think in part Musis Deoque does, which I really like to tell you, which we must always take into account. Now, through digital databanks, we are faced with the same problem as the founding fathers more than 100 years ago. That of the masses of material. We are now in a position to reverse the progress of exception and reduction of material thus achieved. The renunciation of easily accessible material is still an intellectual sacrifice in favor of the feasibility of the project, and has to be made every year. And this is one of my tasks, to keep in mind of the whole collegium, that we should not extend the material. That is, we should not extend the time we need to produce articles. In this situation, the question becomes increasingly urgent. Quo usque tandem? How long can we produce the thesaurus in this way, with this material? Don't we have to speed up in order not to celebrate the 200th anniversary? Fundamental and perhaps in this context, heretical questions must be asked. First, what is the actual value of the slips today for us as thesaurists and for the scientific public outside? The material up to Apuleius can be produced by everyone at home using the databases with the disadvantages mentioned already. But the excerpted period after Apuleius is also of interest outside to those who simply want to know what our articles are based on. Very important for both sides involved is that the TLL slips are lemmatized. Our guests, we have often guest school classes students, they sometimes ask, which has the greater value for you, the archive of slips or the annotated books of your library? Our answer is, in case of fire, we save the books. How can we make our workflow, this is the second point, faster with digital means? Digitizing the slips does not improve their content, and making them digitally readable is a huge technical problem, as we have been shown in contact with Elton Prithvi of the Lessico Etymologico Italiano. Some of you know him perhaps. One possible step into our digital future, or into a digital workflow, would be to find out in a first step for each text up to Apuleius, the database that provides the required edition. The paper slips would then bring in the advantage of lemmatization and also indicate where it is important to consult the apparatus criticus. I'm a little bit skeptic about the second point. A dream would be to have, in a first step, all text up to Apuleius available in a digitally readable and legally copyable form, that is, scans or editions of ebooks with apparatus criticus. New information that today would be noted in the paper edition would be annotated in a certain form there. So that is what I wanted to say here today, perhaps at the end, not without any form of provocation. And I would like to end here, even though I have not dealt with what perhaps the TLL users would like to do us. But maybe you can tell me that now. I thank you for your patience. So.
Thank you so much. Grazie mille per questa bellissima ricostruzione di quello che è oggettivamente ancora oggi il lavoro del tesaurista. Io, come diceva Michele, sono stata e ho visto che si lavora così. Tra l'altro, prima di aprire lo spazio delle domande, mi piaceva dire questo. Sembra che ci sia una sorta di opposizione, da un lato il Thesaurus col suo modo di lavorare che dura così da un secolo, e dall'altro le Digital Humanities, cioè che siano due rette parallele che non si incontrino mai e che soprattutto non si siano mai incontrate. In realtà non è così, forse non tutti sanno che il padre dell'informatica umanistica italiana è padre Roberto Busa. Padre Roberto Busa, perché decide di sviluppare le Digital Humanities? Perché decide di andare in America e chiedere aiuto all'IBM? La risposta è perché vede il Thesaurus. Io ho qui vediamo se riesco a farvi vedere la presentazione che voglio mostrarvi. Ecco, proprio lo spirito, condivido lo schermo, dovrebbe essere, condividi, ok, spero che vediate qui padre Busa all'IBM, proprio nell'headquarter dell'IBM a New York. Non si vede?
Non si vede quello che vuoi fare vedere, secondo me.
Cosa si vede?
Si vede il CV di Stefano Rozzi.
Oh povero, così facciamo una pubblicità a Stefano Rozzi. Allora, come mai? Lo riapro. Comunque avete visto che Stefano Rozzi è uno studente molto bravo. Chiudo e riapro. Ok. Allora, ritorniamo. Condivido. Perfetto. Adesso dovrebbe essere arrivato. Adesso c'è. Ecco, vedete padre Busa nell'headquarter dell'IBM. Da dove ha preso quest'idea? L'ha presa proprio vediamo se riesco a mostrarvi la pagina. Quando padre Busa pensava alla sua opera sull'indice su Tommaso d'Aquino, lei va a Monaco, in qualche modo si mette in contatto. Questa è una cosa che almeno nelle mie ricerche non sono ancora riuscita a chiarire, e vede come sono state prodotte le Zettel. Si spaventa perché pensa di essere solo, di non poter replicare un modello del genere, e quindi da quel momento in poi cerca di replicare il modello di produzione del Thesaurus ma in forma automatizzata, perché sarebbe stato più rapido e forse un modo di ricercare più adeguato a un ricercatore solo, non una larga squadra come era quella che lavorava al Thesaurus. Quindi il Thesaurus ha contribuito in maniera significativa allo sviluppo delle Digital Humanities, anzi forse ha dato l'avvio, perché padre Busa si è un po' spaventato e ha deciso di proseguire in un altro modo. basta, ho parlato troppo, ritorno allo Zoom, se vedo, non vedo le domande, se qualcuno mi può aiutare, interrompo condivisione. C'è qualche domanda, osservazione?
Intanto, mentre si raccolgono le domande, mi permetto di ringraziare il collega Hillen, anche su una base di un ricordo personale, perché io sono stato nel Thesaurus al 1989, inviato, 88-89, inviato dal mio maestro di allora, il professor Lana, perché la mia tesi era sulle silve di Stazio. Ovviamente la S allora e tuttora purtroppo non è nel Thesaurus, e quindi l'unico modo per avere un'idea completa delle attestazioni della parola silva in latino era andare a Monaco, a Marstallplatz, insomma, e lì fare il lavoro che uno doveva fare. Lo ricordo con particolare commozione, anche perché, e qui sempre aspettiamo delle domande serie, a Monaco poi ho conosciuto mia moglie, e quindi quei ricordi del Thesaurus sono ricordi anche, diciamo, non soltanto di tipo scientifico.
Anch'io.
Ah. Per fortuna non è la stessa persona, sono due diverse, e quindi questo...
Abbiamo una domanda di...
Sì, Christoph, vai.
Yeah, thank you very much for your great overview. I have a question about one of the things you said at the end, about basically the kind of strategical discussions you are leading also now. How long can this tandem?
Yeah.
So could you elaborate a bit more which players are involved? So I can imagine that money is an important question, and financing, and also guarantee of financing for a huge amount of years, and the guarantee that this kind of work will still be able to be produced in the next 20 years or so, but probably also kind of advisory board, which has certain ideas. So with whom and against whom do you have to?
Oh, our great enemy in quotation marks is the Union of Academies. This is a great a German institution who gives money to projects, and I think, or I'm afraid, that they are not willing to fund us in the way they did till now, and certainly they will not do it without any limit. So if we apply for new money, which is in fact necessary till 2025, we have to develop a convincing idea how to finish the TLL till, let's say, 2050. And if you can calculate, you see 25 years for the rest of the alphabet, and you see what we have used from the beginning till now. This is no perspective. So we have to speed up, or we have to modify our idea what a TLL is. So this is a discussion actually running in several gremia, but yeah, it's basically, or you can reduce it into the question of money. But I think it's no mystery when I say that TLL costs 1.3 million euro per year. This is absolutely cheap. Every soccer player earns more in a month, but he's not paid by the Union of Academies. So let's be serious. It's the money argument is only a pretext. I think the support for a geisteswissenschaftliche project of this age is decreasing, and it depends on the gremia who decide whether we survive. This sounds very serious, and it is serious. So we are now sitting in smaller groups and trying to improve our workflow. We have to give more to the public. As I said in the beginning, our open access is is very basic. So the idea is to give more searchable material, because the Union of the German Academies does want more. They are the critics of our open access. So this is the situation now. And I have to say, in favor of my colleagues, I'm a layman in digitalization. My colleagues are not. They are young. It's another generation. They have so many ideas. There is an IT department of the Bavarian Academy in Munich, which helps us. There is a competence, but this competence has to be adapted to our project. And there is a gap. They don't understand what we do, and we, in part, understand what they want. So it's a discussion, and there is progress. I see progress. Yeah.
Grazie, thank you so much. Any other questions? Quest'ultima risposta di Hillen apre un po' la scena a considerazioni un po' amare, che quelle che facciamo tutti i giorni, il problema dei soldi, soprattutto quando oggettivamente ci mettiamo in paragone con, come diceva lui, quel che guadagna un calciatore, o anche, diciamolo che siamo tra di noi, con i soldi che circolano nelle scienze dure o nelle scienze applicate. Il Thesaurus è un progetto enorme che ha fatto anche la storia del secolo scorso. Sarebbe davvero un peccato se dovesse finire in qualche modo non raggiungere l'ultimo volume. L'ultima parola, che è Zitum, ho letto
sì. Typical for Bavaria, it's beer.
Ci sono altre reazioni, commenti? Guardavo se c'era qualcosa. Nel frattempo, non voglio chiamarlo in causa in questo modo ex abrupto, ma vorrei anche salutare Maurizio Lana, che è un altro degli host della riunione, che è comparso, che oggi pomeriggio sarà parte attiva. Io non vedo mani alzate, anche perché siamo tutti molto felici di aver assistito a questo racconto di come lavorate e delle parti che sono ancora utili, no? Nel modo di lavorare antico, no? Nel modo di lavorare tradizionale. Non tutto deve essere buttato via. A volte, come dice il proverbio, c'è un po' la tendenza a buttare via il bambino con l'acqua sporca. C'è molto da salvare, sia del nostro modo di lavorare tradizionale, e poi c'è anche molto da integrare con le digital humanities, questo è vero. Anche qui, nota personale per abbassare il livello. Quando sono stata al Thesaurus, sono stata tanto, quasi 3 mesi, oggettivamente in una biblioteca piena di libri, lavorare solo su libri, si lavora di più. Cioè, sarà un mio difetto, però dobbiamo ancora tutti quanti imparare a combinare le due cose. Certo, si deve andare verso il digitale, questo è ovvio, anche per le questioni di distribuzione, di diffusione. Adesso in questi tempi di pandemia abbiamo tutti compreso la grande importanza di avere accesso alle risorse, e questo, adesso non voglio aprire un altro ambito particolarmente spinoso, ci porta anche al problema di quanto costano queste risorse. Hai detto molto bene durante la presentazione che il Thesaurus offerto da De Gruyter è costosissimo, e lo è. Ci sono tantissime risorse anche molto ben fatte. Penso a LLT. LLT è una risorsa meravigliosa, è davvero il database definitivo, ma costa tantissimo, non è possibile abbonarsi, ma neanche per tutte le università, perché bisogna avere un numero di utenti sostenibile. Quindi l'importanza che certamente i progetti finanziati pubblicamente possano il più possibile redistribuire gli esiti delle loro ricerche, e anche che si arrivi a una mediazione più ragionevole con le case editrici, che non sempre sono ragionevolissime, essendo enti che devono fare profitto anche loro. Quindi direi che ho parlato troppo. Se non ci sono altre reazioni o commenti, direi che possiamo darci appuntamento oggi pomeriggio alle 3 per la sessione finale più dedicata alla didattica.
Okay. Ciao.
Arrivederci a tutti
Ciao,
ancora,
arrivederci.
grazie.
Ciao.
Grazie, arrivederci.
Arrivederci a tutti.